Okay, let's get into it. We are diving into a moment that, it feels less like a single battle and more like the final act of this huge 5-year drama. I'm talking about the Battle of Yorktown in 1781. This is the place where the American Revolutionary War, for all intents and purposes, just ends.
Yeah.
And not with a big bang on some open field, but with the sort of quiet desperation of a siege. So our mission today for you is to go way beyond that standard textbook summary. We're going to dig into the logistical nightmare of setting the trap, the brutal day-to-day of the final bombardment, and especially the precise high-stakes political theater of the British surrender.
Yeah.
Because it's in those small moments, those almost arrogant bits of military etiquette, that you can really feel the weight of what was happening.
And that's such a key point. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the main strategic insight here is that Yorktown wasn't just an American victory. Not at all. I mean, General Washington gets the glory, and absolutely, he deserves it. But this was a decisive joint effort. It was a massive undertaking that really hinged entirely on the power of that Franco-American alliance. Yeah. If even one piece of that three-part force, the American troops, the French troops, or the French fleet, if any one of them had failed, the whole thing would have collapsed. That partnership is, well, it's the bedrock of the entire victory.
That coordination alone just seems impossible. How did Washington actually manage to pull off the logistics of moving thousands of American and French troops from New York all the way down to Virginia, and at the same time make sure the French Navy was there to meet them? It sounds like a military miracle.
It was almost a perfect storm of events and strategic deception. For years, Washington had wanted to attack the British in New York City. That was his focus. But the French commanders, especially General Rochambeau, they realized that going after Lord Cornwallis, who had settled his troops in Yorktown, Virginia, offered a much better chance for a decisive blow.
Because he was on a peninsula.
Yeah, exactly. He was essentially trapped on a peninsula. So this move south was really a French idea that Washington, saw the genius in and agreed to.
So Washington pivoted, seeing the tactical opening?
Precisely. And they executed this massive deception campaign. They made the British in New York think an attack was about to happen while secretly marching the bulk of their forces south. But this huge land operation was synchronized with the most crucial element, the French fleet under Admiral de Grasse.
Okay, let's talk about that fleet, because that seems to be the linchpin of the whole thing.
It really is. What's often overlooked is the Battle of the Chesapeake, which happened just weeks before the siege even began. De Grasse fought off a British fleet that was trying to reinforce Cornwallis, and that victory was definitive. It completely sealed off the Chesapeake Bay.
That's the defining moment of the whole campaign then, isn't it? It wasn't just a battle, it was a perfectly executed trap. You've got Washington and Rochambeau surrounding Cornwallis by land.
And De Grasse locks him in by sea. That's it. Cornwallis was backed up against the water with absolutely nowhere to go. And this leads us right into the siege itself, which kicks off in late September 1781.
And we should be clear, when we say a siege, this wasn't a quick assault. This was a slow, grinding operation.
A textbook 18th century siege. Yeah, it was brutal, it was backbreaking work, and it was terrifyingly precise. The Allies didn't just stand back and fire cannons from a distance. The process involved sapping, which is digging parallel lines of trenches. They dig closer and closer to the British defenses, usually under the cover of darkness, to move their heavy artillery forward safely.
So they're inching forward, trench by trench, and the goal is to get close enough to just pulverize the British fortifications.
Exactly. But there was a problem. The British had two critical forward positions, Redoubts 9 and 10, that were blocking them. They had to be taken to complete that second, much closer parallel line. These were heavily fortified earthen forts.
Okay, and this is where some of the real high drama comes in, the actual hand-to-hand fighting.
It does. On the night of October 14th, the Allies launched these synchronized, incredibly dangerous assaults. The French forces went after Redoubt 9, and the American light infantry, actually led by Alexander Hamilton.
Oh, wow. Hamilton himself.
Yep, he led the charge on Redoubt 10, and these were bayonet charges. No time to stop and reload muskets. The whole idea was to be quick and just overwhelming, and storming those two redoubts was the decisive tactical move of the siege. It allowed the Allies to complete their inner trench line, bring their biggest cannon into range, and begin the final crushing bombardment.
So after those redoubts fell, the sheer intensity of the shelling must have been just unbelievable for the British.
It was horrific. I mean, you're talking about non-stop bombardment for days. You have over 16,000 Allied troops and nearly 100 heavy siege guns. Cornwallis and his men were caught. They had the bombardment on one side, and on the other, disease was just rampant typhus, dysentery, and their supplies were rapidly running out.
So he's blocked by sea, he's being pulverized by land, his men are sick and starving. Was his last-ditch effort, his Hail Mary.
Well, his situation became, as they say, completely untenable. He knew the end was near. On the night of October 16th, he tried a desperate move, a secret ferry operation across the York River to Gloucester Point. He was hoping to break through the thin American lines there and march north to New York.
A huge gamble. Did he even come close?
Not at all. The plan was doomed by, of all things, the weather. A sudden, violent storm blew up, scattered his boats, and made the crossing impossible. His forces had to turn back and retreat into the ruins of Yorktown. That failed escape was the final nail in the coffin.
And that brings us to the beginning of the end. So after 20 brutal days and that failed escape, when does Cornwallis finally throw in the towel?
The signal came on the morning of October 17th, 1781. And ironically, it was the 4th anniversary of the British defeat at Saratoga. All the fighting just stopped when Cornwallis finally acknowledged the inevitable.
I love the protocol of this era, the signals. How do they actually communicate something so huge?
The protocol was very specific, very visual, and highly symbolic. A British officer appeared on what was left of their defenses, and he signaled the intention to parley, to talk terms, by sending out a drummer boy, the universally recognized non-combatant, and following him was an officer carrying a plain white handkerchief, the flag of truce.
That's an incredible image. This small drummer boy walking out into total silence after weeks of non-stop cannon fire, followed by an officer with just a piece of white cloth. It's such a stark contrast.
It's pure theater. But that signal, that was just the beginning. It kicked off a 2-day negotiation period. Washington and Rochambeau laid down very specific terms. They made sure the Articles of Capitulation recognized the surrender not just to the Americans, but specifically to the combined French and American army.
So they spent 2 days hammering out the details of exactly how the British would admit defeat to give it maximum symbolic weight for the alliance.
Exactly. And the Allies insisted on terms similar to the humiliating ones the British had forced on the Americans at Charleston in 1780. The formal documents were signed on October 19th. That officially sealed the defeat. But the ceremony, the actual marching out, that's what gave us the lasting image of the American victory.
And this is where the protocol becomes this astonishing act of defiance. When it's time for the surrender, Lord Charles Cornwallis is a no-show.
Yes. It's one of the most studied and dramatic moments in military history. Cornwallis claimed to be severely ill of fever. And while he may have genuinely been unwell, historians widely agree it was a very convenient illness. It was designed to spare him the personal humiliation of handing his sword to a colonial rebel.
He tried to dodge the defining moment of his own career. So who did he send instead?
He sent his second-in-command, General Charles O'Hara, to represent the entire defeated British force. And this was a clear, intentional slight. It was a breach of etiquette designed to show his contempt for the victor.
But Washington and Rochambeau, they were ready for this kind of political chess match, right? Let's walk through that symbolic exchange, because the way this sword is passed around tells the whole story.
It really does. So O'Hara rides out at the head of the British column, acting as Cornwallis. His first move is highly calculated. He tries to offer his sword to the French commander, Rochambeau.
Why Rochambeau first? What's the message there?
By offering the sword to the Frenchman, O'Hara was trying to frame the defeat as a loss to another European power, a traditional rival. He was basically trying to ignore the Americans entirely, to deny Washington the dignity of personally receiving the surrender.
But Rochambeau wasn't having it.
Absolutely not. Rochambeau was a master of diplomacy. He immediately and firmly pointed O'Hara toward General Washington. He wouldn't accept a subordinate sword, and he wouldn't let the British diminish the American role.
Okay, so now O'Hara has to face Washington. What does Washington do? Does he accept the sword from a subordinate, which would sort of validate Cornwallis's insult?
No. Washington responds with a perfect mirror image of the insult. Since Cornwallis had degraded the ceremony by sending his number 2, Washington refused to accept the sword from O'Hara himself. Instead, Washington dramatically directs O'Hara to his own second-in-command, General Benjamin Lincoln.
That is beautiful. It's like saying, oh, this is too embarrassing for your commander. Fine. My stature is too high to accept it from your stand-in. Deal with my subordinate.
It was a perfect piece of military theater. It showed the world that the head of the American army refused to lower his standing. And what's more, Lincoln himself had suffered a humiliating surrender to the British at Charleston the year before. So for him to be the one to accept the sword, it was a powerful moment of redemption.
So O'Hara finally hands the sword to Lincoln. The official act is complete. What was the final scene for the thousands of British troops watching this?
The remaining 7,000 British soldiers then had to march out. And the scene, I mean, it must have been overwhelming. They marched between two long lines of victorious soldiers, the French in their immaculate white and blue uniforms on one side, and the Americans, in their worn but dignified gear on the other. They marched to a field where they had to lay down their arms, their muskets, their swords, and their flags into a massive pile. It was the ultimate symbol of defeat.
A huge, tangible victory, not just of men, but of material.
Indeed. The number captured was staggering. Over 7,000 British officers and men, a huge portion of their army in North America. And they also seized enormous amounts of supplies, cannon, horses. This wasn't just a win, it was the collapse of the entire British war effort in the South.
And how quickly did the political shockwaves from Yorktown travel to London?
Instantly and decisively. When news reached London in late November, the British Prime Minister, Lord North, reportedly cried out, "Oh God, it is all over." It completely shattered the political will in Parliament to keep funding the war.
So the fighting pretty much stops in 81, but the diplomacy takes a couple more years to finalize everything.
That's right. The military reality was set at Yorktown. The diplomatic resolution was the Treaty of Paris in 1783, which officially recognized the independence of the United States. You could say Yorktown was the military event that secured the nation's birth certificate.
So to boil it all down, the key takeaway here is that Yorktown was critical not just because of the victory itself, but because the strategy was so flawless, that coordinated trap, and because the ceremony of surrender was used as this powerful tool to assert the sovereignty of the new nation.
Exactly. And here's a final thought for you to consider. While Washington used the ceremony to establish American dignity, Cornwallis's calculated absence created its own lasting narrative. A narrative of British resistance, even in defeat. By refusing to show up, he kind of avoided complete personal shame and allowed the British to frame it not as a total failure, but as being overwhelmed by this massive, unavoidable alliance. So think about that. How did one general's refusal to attend a ceremony end up shaping how an entire empire processed its greatest colonial loss? It just reminds us that protocol and public image are often just as powerful as cannon fire in shaping how we remember history.
Powerful stuff. You now have the key insights from the crucial naval block to the dramatic refusal of the sword. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll catch you next time. Welcome to the deep dive. So, okay, forget the images you might have of triumphant flags and, defeated drums for just a minute. Today, we're going back to October 19, 1781, and we're not just there to witness the famous end of major British resistance at Yorktown, but to actually read the official rule book for that moment.
We are going way beyond just the narrative of surrender. We're diving right into the source material, the Articles of Capitulation at Yorktown. And this isn't just military history. It's a deep dive into the logistical details that really provided the foundation for American independence. Our mission is to look at the exact terms these commanders agreed on. How did they formally process an entire defeated army?
And it's a document signed at the absolute highest level. I mean, the players involved here literally define the shape of the new world. On the Allied side, you've got General George Washington, of course, leading the Americans.
Right.
And the crucial French commanders, Rochambeau for the army, and Admiral Legrasse, whose naval blockade was, it was everything.
Indispensable. And then on the British side, you have Lord Cornwallis, technically in command. But this is where the drama and the formality really start to merge. Cornwallis didn't personally show up to the signing ceremony.
Claimed he was sick, right?
He did, but it was pretty widely seen as a political snub. He was, refusing to formally surrender to Washington.
Right. So instead, the British were represented during the actual signing by General Charles O'Hara. And that detail, just that one little thing, the commander refusing to show up, it really underscores the massive psychological weight of this defeat, even before we get into the dry legal text.
Exactly.
The whole document, the Articles, is about setting these rules of disengagement and defining the status of the conquered.
That's right. It turns the chaotic reality of a siege ending into an orderly, recognized transfer of power. And the fact that the Allied commanders, you have Washington, Rochambeau, and the French Navy, they all had to sign off.
Ah, that's a key point.
It is. It shows this was a truly multilateral agreement. Every single clause, every detail we're about to talk about, had to be carefully negotiated between three separate military powers.
Okay, so let's unpack this right away. Let's jump into section 1. The rules of surrender and Allied logistics. The first, and I guess the most immediate thing you have to deal with is the people. What happened to the thousands of soldiers and seamen in the British garrisons of York and Gloucester?
They formally became prisoners of war. But here's the critical distinction, and it speaks volumes about the alliance itself. The articles formally delineated who got which prisoners.
So it wasn't just one big pot of POWs for the Allies to share.
Not at all. And that separation, it really reveals the financial and, the tactical realities of the coalition.
Wait, why the split then? Was this just about resources, or was it some kind of pre-negotiated demand by the French for leverage? What was that about?
So the terms stipulated that the land troops, so the bulk of Cornwallis's army, they became prisoners of the United States. They would be housed, fed, and guarded by the fledgling American government. But the naval personnel who were captured, specifically the seamen on the water, were designated as prisoners belonging exclusively to the French Navy.
That is fascinating. So it's not just bureaucracy, it's basically a financial contract defining who's accountable for what. The Cornwallis Navy did the decisive blockade. They took the risk at sea.
Exactly. The split makes it clear that the French were compensated in a way for that indispensable naval effort. They gained legal control over enemy naval personnel, which was crucial not just for prestige, but for the whole logistical burden and, the eventual exchange of those prisoners.
It really solidifies their standing as a co-victor, not just some auxiliary force.
Precisely, a co-victor.
And a very clear accounting of assets had to follow, not just human ones. You mentioned military assets. The sources stressed that all physical equipment had to be delivered intact. No hiding supplies, no sabotaging artillery.
That's pretty standard in a formal capitulation, but the enforcement here was paramount. All British artillery, arms, military equipment, and what they called public stores, all of it had to be inventoried and handed over.
Which suggests they were really determined not just to win the battle, but to get their hands on all that valuable war material.
Of course. They needed it for the rest of the conflict. Destroying those assets would have been a direct violation of the articles.
And the requirements got incredibly specific, right down to points on a map. It wasn't just a broad hand over the keys.
No, it was meticulous, almost architectural, the planning. For instance, the articles called for the handover of 2 specific redoubts on the left flank of Yorktown to designated American and French troops.
And for you listening, a redoubt is basically a small enclosed fort, a key defensive point.
It is. And handing over those 2 specific redoubts first was this formal tactical acknowledgement that the British line was completely broken, that the surrender was complete. It was a choreographed tactical exchange that signaled the end.
That transition from active fighting to just legal paperwork is incredible. Which brings us to section 2, where we see that even in this ultimate humiliation of surrender, the articles had a certain level of nuance, especially around class divisions.
Absolutely. We move from the mass surrender of soldiers to these specific negotiated exemptions. For the British officers, for example, there was a significant provision. It allowed those who were not actively engaged in the defense to go on parole.
So what does on parole actually mean in this context? They weren't just set free to walk home, were they?
No, not at all. They were still bound by the surrender. Parole basically meant they gave their word of honor not to take up arms again until they were formally exchanged. Critically, it gave them much more freedom and comfort than the enlisted men who were headed for prison camps.
And their destinations were spelled out too, right? Europe, New York.
Yes, or other British-held posts in America. It suggests the Allies were trying to manage a security risk while still, respecting the military customs of the time.
It also seems practical. It must have relieved the burden of housing hundreds of high-ranking prisoners.
It did, and it ensured they couldn't immediately rejoin the fighting on the American front. It was a calculated risk, but one that helped ensure the officer corps was disarmed in an orderly way.
Okay, now, you mentioned a really curious exemption. It's about one specific ship, the sloop Bonetta. Why on earth did the British get to keep this one ship, even temporarily, especially since the French claimed all the naval prisoners?
This is where logistics really met diplomacy. The British sloop Bonetta was allowed to stay under Cornwallis's control for one very, very specific purpose: to carry dispatches to the British command in New York.
Ah, so it wasn't just about sharing the bad news, it was about controlling the information, preventing rumors or some kind of unauthorized communication that might trigger a counterattack somewhere else.
Precisely. If the news of Yorktown had traveled unofficially, or if Cornwallis had to send some unapproved dispatch ship, the Allies could have just seized it, and that would have left a dangerous gap in the communication chain.
So allowing the Bonetta to pass safely.
Under agreed-upon immunity, yes. It ensured that the British Central Command got the definitive news straight from Cornwallis, confirming the end of the conflict in Virginia. No ambiguity.
That level of detail is just remarkable. And what's equally fascinating is that alongside all these rules about arms and paroles, the articles also dealt with caring for the wounded.
Absolutely. The humanitarian provisions were very clear. The sick and wounded British soldiers were to receive humane treatment. They were even allowed to be attended by their own surgeons.
Which must have been huge for morale and, continuity of care.
It was, but the key logistical point was that the supplies needed for their care were to be furnished by the American hospitals.
So shifting the logistical burden immediately.
Yes. It formalized the transfer of responsibility. The American side was now on the hook for the costs and organization of caring for the defeated, but they allowed the enemy's medical expertise to remain. It was both practical and, an acknowledgement of the civilized standards of warfare they were trying to uphold.
Which brings us to Section 3. And I think this is maybe the most politically charged part of the whole document, the unaccepted condition. Our sources are very clear that there was one article the Americans just flat out refused to accept.
Indeed. And it wasn't about arms or prisoners. It was about the political future of the country. It raises this critical, thorny question about who exactly was being surrendered here.
Just the military or something more?
Exactly. Was it just the military personnel, or was it also a protection for American citizens who had chosen the other side?
So what was Cornwallis trying to get in that rejected article?
He was trying to include a provision that would have prevented any punishment of local inhabitants who had sided with the British, the Loyalists.
The Tories. He was trying to secure amnesty for them.
He was. Protection for American citizens who had committed themselves to the crown.
And Washington, representing the brand new United States, said absolutely not. That rejection feels monumental. It goes so far beyond the technical surrender of an army.
Oh, it is. If we connect this to the bigger picture, that single rejection draws a crucial political boundary. Washington understood that his military victory had to be kept separate from the civil and political justice that would follow.
Accepting that clause would have meant the military surrender document was granting amnesty for treason against a state that wasn't even fully formed yet.
It would have tied the hands of the future American government right at its inception.
Wow.
Precisely. The refusal showed that while the American forces were willing to grant terms to the British military, that agreement did not extend to insulating American citizens from the potential consequences from their own government. It was an assertion of sovereignty over domestic political issues.
So the Articles of Capitulation, they define the relationship between two warring armies, but they deliberately left the fate of the Loyalists up to the new American government. That must have immediately terrified thousands of people.
It absolutely did. It confirmed that the only protection the Loyalists had was to flee with the British forces, or, face judgment under American law. The surrender provided military closure, but it created an immediate, desperate political and humanitarian crisis for those who had chosen the losing side in what was, at its heart, a civil conflict.
It makes the document strictly a military instrument, not a peace treaty or a civil rights guarantee.
It's a perfect way to put it.
It's a powerful statement that military victory doesn't just erase political choices.
Yeah.
So what does this entire document, these articles, what do they really mean for the big picture of the Revolutionary War?
I mean, at the end of the day, the articles were the indispensable practical mechanism for transitioning from active rebellion to recognized nationhood. They set up formal protocols for prisoners, for the transfer of assets, parole for officers, care for the wounded.
All the nitty-gritty details.
All of it. And by securing this formal, structured, and globally recognized surrender, they did more than just win a battle. They officially and undeniably ended British military resistance in the American colonies, which laid the bedrock for the Treaty of Paris and ultimately independence.
It turned a messy military victory into an irreversible political fact. But that rejected article about the Loyalists, That shadow hanging over the document is still incredibly stark.
And this raises an important question, one for you to consider long after the armies have marched away. When a formal military surrender specifically leaves these deeply entrenched domestic political issues, like the fate of collaborators or loyal citizens, when it leaves them unresolved, what are the long-term consequences for the stability and the identity of that new nation? That specific political vacuum created by Washington's firm rejection, it shaped the domestic tension and the very definition of citizenship in America for decades to come. That is something for you to mull over. You know, when you think about the end of the American Revolution, what's the first image that comes to mind?
Oh, it's always General Washington, right? Standing there at Yorktown in 1781, the British surrendering.
Exactly. It's this powerful image of the colonists' land forces finally winning.
And it's a true story, of course, but focusing only on that land battle, it creates a huge blind spot. It completely misses the one thing that really decided it all.
And it wasn't happening on land at all.
Not even close. It was happening out of sight, on the water. The victory at Yorktown wasn't really one with shovels and muskets. It was one with masts and naval cannons.
So that's our mission for this deep dive. We're going to look at the sources around the French Navy's role in 1781. And they suggest it wasn't just, a helping hand. It was the absolute linchpin.
Yeah, the one piece that had to fall into place perfectly. We're going to fast track through the maneuvers, the risks, and the strategic wins at sea that basically turned Yorktown from a stalemate into an inevitable British disaster.
Right. So let's set the stage. It's late summer, 1781. General Cornwallis and his army are dug in at Yorktown, Virginia.
And he's being besieged by American and French troops on land.
But here's the puzzle that always gets me. You're a British general, you're on the coast, and your empire's greatest strength is its navy. So why didn't you just get reinforcements or, just pack up and evacuate by sea?
Well, that's because the location itself is the key to the trap. Yorktown is on this narrow peninsula.
Okay.
It's surrounded by the York River on one side and the massive Chesapeake Bay on the other. You have to think of the Chesapeake Bay as like the main highway for everything in that region.
The logistical artery.
The only one that mattered. For the British, it was their lifeline for resupply, for reinforcements, and most importantly, for escape.
So if the Royal Navy, the most powerful navy in the world, controls that bay, Cornwallis can just sit there forever. They could ferry in food, ammo, men.
Or just pull them out if things got too hot. Exactly. So for the British, controlling that water was everything. If they lose it, the army is completely cut off.
And that leads us right to the main event. The one that I think gets treated like a footnote in a lot of history books, the Battle of the Chesapeake.
Sometimes called the Battle of the Capes. And yeah, this is the turning point. This is where it all happens.
So this is early September 1781.
Right. In Washington and the French General Rochambeau, they'd been planning this for months. But their whole gamble rested on one thing.
The French fleet.
The French fleet, led by Admiral de Grasse, showing up on time and, crucially, taking control of the bay.
And de Grasse was coming all the way from the Caribbean, which sounds like a massive risk in itself.
It was a huge logistical feat. He had something like 28 ships on the line. These are the massive warships. And he arrived at the Chesapeake just in the nick of time.
And the British knew he was coming.
Oh, yeah. They set their own fleet down from New York under Admiral Thomas Graves to intercept him and relieve Cornwallis. So this wasn't some minor skirmish. This was for all the marbles.
So here's where it gets really interesting for me. The British Navy almost never lost big naval battles. How did de Grasse pull this off? Was it just luck?
No, not at all. It was tactical discipline. De Grasse used this maneuver to establish a line of battle.
What does that mean, a line of battle?
It's basically getting all your ships in a single file line, broadsides facing the enemy. It prevents the other side from sort of ganging up on your individual ships.
I see.
And he just executed it better. The British couldn't deploy effectively, and the French managed to damage several key British ships early in the fight. Crippled them, really.
So it wasn't about sinking a bunch of ships, it was about strategic damage.
Precisely. It made them structurally unsound, unable to fight effectively. So after a few days of trying to reform and re-engage, Admiral Graves realizes his fleet is just too beaten up.
And he can't risk losing the whole squadron.
He can't. So he makes the decision to turn back to New York for repairs. And that single decision to retreat, that was the moment the fate of Yorktown was sealed.
Wow. So the moment Graves sailed north, the game was over for Cornwallis on the ground, even though the siege was just getting started.
That's the key. That victory gave the French total, undisputed control over the entire Chesapeake Bay. This wasn't just a win, it was a quarantine.
Okay, let's focus on that. Because losing the bay, it sounds like it created a trap with two parts, like a double-edged sword for Cornwallis.
That's the perfect way to look at it, because the French Navy immediately started doing two things at once. First, the blockade. Strategic isolation.
I can only imagine what that felt like for the British troops. You're just waiting for ships to appear on the horizon, and they never come.
And you can imagine the sense of dread setting in. The blockade cut off any chance of reinforcements. No men, no food, no ammo. But maybe even more important, it cut off any chance of evacuation.
Right. If Graves had won, there was always an escape hatch.
And once Graves left, that escape hatch slammed shut. He was trapped. He couldn't run. The French fleet was just too strong, covering every route out. He was completely stuck.
But wait, a quick question on that. The British had naval superiority globally. Why couldn't they just send another, bigger fleet to break the blockade?
That's a great question, and the answer is just time. You can't just materialize a fleet. The damaged ships in New York needed weeks of repair. Any ships from Europe were months away.
So de Grasse didn't need to hold the bay forever.
He just needed to hold it long enough for the land siege to become irreversible. He seized the moment perfectly.
Okay, so that's one edge of the sword, the blockade. But you said the French were doing more than just sitting there. They were actively helping on land.
Yes, that's the second function. Active logistical support. This is where naval power turns directly into land power.
How so?
Well, first, with the French fleet there, the Allied armies could completely surround Yorktown without worrying about being attacked from the sea. But the big thing, the really crucial part, was the fleet became a delivery service.
Delivering what?
The heavy firepower. The siege cannons. You need massive artillery to break down fortifications. 18-pounders, 24-pounders, mortars. These things weigh tons.
And you can't just drag that stuff for hundreds of miles over colonial roads. Not quickly, anyway.
It's nearly impossible. The roads were terrible, so the French Navy just sailed right up and landed all this heavy siege equipment right at the front door.
So they were the hammer, basically.
They delivered the hammer that allowed the American and French armies to just pound the British defenses into dust.
Our sources are pretty clear on this.
Yeah.
Without that blockade and without that delivery of heavy guns, the British could have held out, maybe even been evacuated. The war could have dragged on.
And while the land forces, Washington's leadership, the soldiers in the trenches, they deserve immense credit for executing the siege.
Of course.
But the sources we've looked at really make an argument about causality. Washington's plan was brilliant, but it was contingent. It depended on the Navy. De Grasse's victory, on the other hand, was absolute. It made the outcome on land a certainty.
The Army completed the trap, but the Navy built the walls.
That's a great way to put it.
So let's tie it all together. How do we draw a straight line from that sea battle in early September to Cornwallis waving the white flag just 6 weeks later?
The so what is pretty clear. The French control of the bay created a simple, cold, hard fact for Cornwallis. No help is coming. Relief is impossible.
His last hope was gone, and he didn't even see the battle that decided it.
Exactly. He's stuck there watching his supplies dwindle, while at the same time, he's watching the enemy get stronger and stronger, with all this massive artillery being unloaded from French ships.
So his surrender wasn't really a moment of battlefield defeat, it was just accepting the inevitable.
It was a rational decision based on an inescapable strategic reality that the French Navy had created. That realization just hastened his surrender. He held out as long as he could, but when the Allied bombardment started, it was over.
The counterfactual is so strong. Without the French Navy, no decisive victory at Yorktown.
The whole thing hinged on their ability to isolate that battlefield.
It's such a modern-sounding strategy, really. Control the logistics, control the choke points, and you win the war. We think of Yorktown as Washington's masterpiece, but it was really a combined arms victory executed perfectly at sea first.
It took the land siege from being a high-stakes gamble and turned it into a guaranteed success. Washington knew he could trap Cornwallis on land, but he needed a guarantee that Cornwallis couldn't just use his ships to escape.
And de Grasse gave him that guarantee.
He did.
Okay, so let's bring this all home. The main takeaway from this deep dive is that the classic story of Yorktown is missing its first chapter. The surrender hinges almost entirely on Admiral de Grasse and the French fleet controlling the Chesapeake Bay.
Right. We've gone past the simple narrative to see the nuts and bolts of the strategic situation that forced Cornwallis's hand.
And it leaves you with a really interesting question to think about, especially when you look at modern conflicts.
Yeah, we always focus on the front lines, the soldiers we can see fighting. But Yorktown proves that sometimes the real decisive action, the thing that drives historical change, is happening hundreds of miles away. It's a naval maneuver, a logistical operation.
So are we looking at the wrong map?
Maybe. We should always be thinking about the power of choke points and strategic isolation. It doesn't matter if it's a sea lane, a railway, or even digital infrastructure today. Sometimes the most important victory isn't about fighting the army. It's about cutting the lines that allow that army to exist in the first place. That's the real lesson of the Chesapeake.